last year I approached Mike about running a training day down at their facility in Devon. There's one or two in the room. Steve, you were one, John, you were another. Myself were down there, and I found it amazing. What I found is we had about a group of 20, I'm going to call them general surveyors, but some were involved in workboats, some not. But no one had ever really, from what I could see, apart from Steve perhaps, actually been on board one of these crew transfer vessels. And I think we all found it. Oh, sorry, John, you've been on one as well. I'm getting barracked in the back of the room. But what I found interesting is that it just presented a whole different set of challenges. And we spent an entire day in South Devon on board one of these vessels, just gathering notes. And at one point, I hadn't appreciated how many hatches there are around the side of these vessels. So there's 20 people. I'm looking around thinking, where did they all go? They'd all gone down to these hatches and vanished underneath. It was just bizarre. So, Mike, I'm looking forward to this because I know this will be an interesting presentation. So, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to you. Thanks, Mike. Down the button.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for the invitation as a vessel operator to come along and speak to you today. I'm hopefully going to give you some insight into our world from the operator's point of view. My background is in surveying, but for the last 5 years I've been the operations manager for Offshore Turbine Services. We're a middle-size, I suppose you would call us, crew transfer company, and hopefully I'll shed some more light on the sector. Some of you, I know, are obviously already familiar with it. If you're from the larger ship background, hopefully I can enlighten you a bit more about what we do. And in particular, what I'd like to do, and I hope it doesn't appear too dry, I do want to drill in and actually look at a few specific questions. I could have picked probably 20 or 30 different ones. I looked at half a dozen questions that always sort of crop up as being issues when we're reviewing MISWs. So I've sort of thrown those in very specifically. So, but feel free to pitch in at any point if you've got any questions on those points. So first of all, we're a crew transfer company, but we should stress that there are really probably 3 categories of vessels commonly seen on wind farms and other renewable sites, if we're including tidal and wave and those sorts of sites. All these vessels are under 24 metres and under 500 tonnes, hence they're going to have an MISW undertaken on them. So we've got your classic multi-cats, which you'll all be familiar with. Also got a lot of sub 24 metre tugs doing a lot of towing work. So there's that category as well. And then our area of specialty, which is the crew transfer vessels. And they range from anything from still seeing 12, 13 metre boats on site right up to 26, 27 metre overall, 23.99 metre load line length. So, large vessels that are very complex. I'll focus mainly on these, but say that a lot of what we're going to cover today is going to be relevant to all 3 of those classes of vessels. There are more than 400 of these vessels operating in Northern Europe at the moment, and obviously soon we're going to see this industry expand out into Taiwan and the United States further, and that number of vessels will inevitably increase further again. So there are obviously, that's an awful lot of surveys that have got to be done each year, and we have even encountered situations where clients have specified that they need a survey, an MISW that's less than 6 months old. So we've had boats actually have 2 MISWs within a 12-month period. So what do these boats do specifically? Well, I say the name can be a bit misleading. They're referred to as crew transfer vessels, or perhaps better would be a personnel transfer vessel. That's their primary job and what they were sort of originally invented for. And there you have perhaps the problem of all our sort of interrogation by clients and stakeholders. There's probably the most valuable asset that any company owns. That's a Siemens technician going up a turbine that we've transported him to. Obviously, the due diligence that a company like, whether it's Siemens or Ørsted, that's required if they're going to put their personnel on your boat, it's very different, the sort of due diligence that's required if it's a multi-cat or a tug that's towing something where there's none of their personnel on board. So that's what probably causes the first sort of angst amongst the customer. And secondly, obviously, it's the speed that these boats are operating at. anything from 20, even 30 knots in sometimes less than ideal conditions, often at night, and often in poor visibility. There's a lot of responsibility there, not from just the equipment, obviously, but from the human element. So that's the primary job of a personnel transfer vessel, is getting people up to, normally, say historically it was always up to 12 people onto site. Now we're seeing 24 and even more being transported under the new regulations. Not only are they transporting personnel, they're working with cable laying ships, they're working with trenching vessels. They might be just simply taking a hard drive, believe it or not, from a trenching vessel that's just got an ROV on seabed. That hard drive needs to go back to a rep on shore. Boat will pop out there, do a 50-mile run, take it back to shore so that somebody can download some data and analyse what's being done during the day. So they've got very much a multi-role. Again, they weren't designed as cargo vessels, but they inevitably are cargo vessels. They've all got rated decks. They've got security points, sea fastenings on deck of various sorts, not perhaps all the type that you'll be used to seeing. They could be carrying anything up to 20 tons of cargo of all sorts of unusual shapes and sizes. So are the crew trained to handle that cargo, and is the vessel suitable for transporting that cargo? Again, classic sort of site. Here's a crew transfer vessel being used to actually demobilize or de-rig generators from a wind farm. Got a 2-ton generator being lowered down. Again, that personnel standing there is a secondary contractor. It's not part of the vessel crew. So you've got this interaction of many different parties. Finally, a bit difficult to see in that photo, perhaps the highest risk element or activity that crew transfer vessels do, transferring fuel on site. So during the build stage of a wind farm, there'll normally be temporary power, large generators, you saw in the last photo, placed on each tower to supply electricity to the turbine before it gets hooked up to the grid. They've often got 1,000 or 2,000 litre fuel tanks on the turbine, and a crew transfer vessel, typically it's always pumping from its own tanks for various DG reasons, which we'll go into later, but could be carrying anywhere up to 15,000 litres or more of diesel simply for transferring up to the temporary power. Obviously, this is a high-risk game. We've got obviously pollution issues as well as other hazards involved, and again a combination of there's the vessel crew at that end of the hose, but at the other end of the hose you've got a secondary contractor, so you've got a real interaction again of different personnel. So the major stakeholders, you're all familiar with these players. That's not by no means exhaustive. It's just an idea of what we see in Northern Europe at the moment. The big names, interestingly, are often not the instructing party. And that's where some of the twists and turns come in this whole process. We've got the major players at the top who you could call the developers, the site developers. You've got major manufacturers of wind farm turbines, generators on this side. And then over there, some of the big players in the European market who are involved in the construction stage. However, the most common instructing party for an MISW is going to be us, the vessel operator, because part of the tender process is often the first thing the client's going to ask for is, can you send us a copy of your last MISW? So to start the whole process rolling, we're going to be contacting our local eCMID surveyor and asking him on board to come and do a survey or an inspection or an audit. In fact, the interesting thing is it often will get combined inevitably with other surveys, and that's obviously got potential issues. But I would say the top there, the most awkward situation here is this conflict of interest, and I can't stress it enough. We're requesting a surveyor to come on board for a report that we're then going to be using with a third party. It's only got relevance and true independence if everybody, all three parties involved here, take this issue seriously. For example, our primary eCMID surveying organisation, we happen to use MECAL, they're strong down in our part of the world in the southwest, We always have this, it's both a written and an unwritten rule of they provide no consultancy to us whatsoever. So they do not give us any advice throughout the year, because the point being is they can't come on board, survey the boat, and then effectively be surveying their own work. We might well, and we do indeed, use them for doing our workboat code surveys and annual inspections, but we wouldn't ask them to do anything else on board the boat. And I say that's an important element of this process. However, the opportunity there, the positive of that situation, it means that as a vessel operator, we've got that MISW back with any of the findings that we can then act on before we get to site. The margins in our business are such that we don't want to be arriving on site, particularly if it's 3, 4, 5 days steaming away, and then have to try and rectify a whole load of findings that a surveyor finds if it was to be done on site. So this gives an opportunity to get things right before we show up. And our experience is the likes of Orsted and Siemens, they're in agreement with that. They want to see it ahead of time, and then we will then forward our closeouts to them before we arrive. After the vessel operator, I would say the most likely second sort of instructing party will actually, again, it won't be a major player, it will be a secondary contractor. So for example, the personnel you saw earlier who are doing the fuel transfer or lowering the generator, they will request a copy of an MISW so that they can forward it either to a principal contractor or wind farm operator. So I'll try not to make this too dry, but what I'd like to do is actually sort of go through the MISW. This is version 3, obviously, which is the current one, and just look at some areas where we see some issues. I'll start with the index of certificates, because this always sort of puzzles me a little in that it doesn't generate findings, and we've actually had some accidentally go in where the dates are not right, and of course nobody notices. Because everyone knows that the client, the first thing the actual major wind farm operator is going to do is they're going to flick to the findings page, they're going to read the findings, and they're not going to, we all do that when we read surveys. So at the moment, there seems to be a bit of a weakness in that the index of certificates is a bit of an Achilles heel. Secondly, the index of certificates is accessible to us, and we normally upload all that data. It's designed to try and reduce the amount of time spent by the inspector, but therefore, it's got to be checked, because otherwise you're relying totally on the vessel operator having actually completed this. Now, I would say the most important thing, and perhaps it's overlooked, particularly if you've got a background that's used to working on ships over 500 tons, all of these vessels, we're talking about under 500 tons and under 24 meters, they're not legally obliged to be operating an ISM. So some of these things are going to come as a bit of a surprise to them. If they've been working as an angling vessel, and I kid you not, and all of a sudden they need an MISW doing, you ask them for an asbestos-free certificate for their 25-year-old aluminium angling boat or GLP angling boat, they're going to be a little surprised. So you do need to give these companies a bit of a heads up as to what's coming. The DG Code of Compliance, Document of Compliance, this is now, thankfully, is sort of accepted throughout the industry. If you're in the renewable sector, it's accepted that you'll have one of these. But we went for many years, we're only talking 2013, 2014, before the MCA really did tighten up on this and say, you can't be moving propane cylinders on deck or 10 jerry cans of petrol on deck that you're going to use on portable generators without having an IMDG DOC. Again, it's something which you're going to need to give your vessel operator a heads up that he needs, because at the moment, the situation in the United Kingdom still is that DOC can only be issued by the MCA. It's not given to coding authorities or anybody else hasn't got the right yet to do that. I say these are all straight off. If you're not familiar with the MISW, these I've just sort of cherry picked these off all the way down the page as to ones that are interesting. Passenger liability. Most of the passenger transfer vessels and the tugboats are going to be up to a maximum of 12 passengers. The Athens Convention doesn't apply to them. However, the passenger liability box in that certificate section, you should be cross-checking their P&I insurance, because that's the element. That passenger liability will be a line specifically mentioned in their P&I. Another one, if you're a small workboat, you're not going to come across portable water quality test certificates before you. Just not going to have happened in most small workboats. So again, you're going to need to expand. Is that just a TBC? Is it a Legionella? Is it 6 monthly? Is it yearly? Some guidance on that, because there's no guidance at all in the MISW as to what's required. Normally, most companies, ourselves included, you do it on a risk-based, sort of approach as to you're going to test everything, see if you've got a problem, and then decide whether you're going to test more often or less often. And finally, one which is critical, again, it's a real problem. These are often unclassed vessels in the sub 24 metre sector. There are lots of class vessels as well, but it means that can mean anything from a one-page, yes, there's a radio, to a full proper class radio survey. So again, you're going to need to decide or liaise with the final end user, the client of the report, what's expected. Particularly if you're dealing with the German authorities or vessels operating in Germany, that's an area which they're always very keen on, which again wouldn't be required, for example, in the UK, Belgium, or the Netherlands.
Just a quick one here. It's interesting that the boats that will end up. Sorry, thank you. Yeah, the boats that are going to come into this industry and work, though, I mean, surely they're going to be working for an operator such as yourself or similar companies, that they will have had a good briefing and a good understanding of what the industry requires before a eCMID inspector walks on board.
Not necessarily. I would say yes, you'd have to have had your head in the sand to have missed it. However, there's still a lot of new players coming in, or they've got boats at the right prices. Particularly when you look at these there are a lot of survey vessels, for example, and they are certainly in the sub 20 metre, often sub 15 metre size, that are doing hydrographic survey work on wind farms, even during the construction phase. And they can be sourced from any number of small operators. And this will all be totally new territory to them.
So it's a kind of, you've got so these small boats are likely to be chartered in by an operator like yourself?
No,
self-managed vessel?
They could be a self-managed one-man. I know they're less and less now, but it could be a one-man operation that's self-managed vessel.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's kind of similar. I mean, most of my background is in the offshore oil and gas,
right.
And in the past I've worked with the likes of Eddie here, with the Marine Safety Forum, where we used to assist with the likes of fishing vessels that would be used for guard vessel work in the North Sea.
Yes.
But for example, these guard vessels would be made very, very clear what would be required of them before they would be engaged by the Scottish Fisheries Federation to be put out on guard vessel work.
Yes.
So in this case, vessels that might come into the industry, surely the policing of it should start at the top, where you're kind of told, okay, for you to actually be allowed into this industry, you need to know that you need this, this, and this, and you need to be familiar with this, this, and this.
There's nobody out there performing that role. And as I say, that's where you go back to this potential conflict of interest, where you become both the consultant and the inspector. So you could, because you could be bidding on work. Yes, It's
an interesting point you raised there, Mike. But our job as an inspector isn't to be particularly a consultant, because you start to come into direct conflict of interest. Yeah. And I think the same for anybody coding a vessel. If they're carrying out an MISW at the same time or similar time, then they're inspecting their own coding work. We don't do that as when we do an eCMID on a DP2 vessel, for example, we are not class. Class don't do eCMIDs. Yeah. Well, in theory they don't. No, the Benson's acquisition possibly changed that. But I kind of agree with what's said there, that if we're going to do EMISW on the vessel, then we would have a certain expectation. And if that expectation isn't there, then it should have been made certainly apparent by whoever's chartering the vessel. Because if you're going into it on a completely green basis, then you are going to encounter a significant amount of findings, which may result in you not being hired in the first place. So I think you're looking at actually two separate pieces of work there, potentially even three, because my own personal view is if you're coding the vessel, you shouldn't be doing the eCMID. That is my personal view. Other people may have a completely different view of that altogether. But that's just that. I do think that if vessels need consultation beforehand, then they should be taking that before the surveyor or inspector turns up. Because we've encountered it where we've gone on board vessels and the vessel has not been fit for inspection. And that's not a good position to be in. And we've even been to a fact where we do them on behalf of the client, doing their in-surveys and other things where a eCMID is being carried out by, eCMID and MISW is being carried out by someone, again, which has not been that proficiently done. And you end up with a huge list of findings bespoke to what the client is looking for. So the first thing I would say is, if you're going to sign a contract with somebody, ask for what the contract requires.
Yes, I totally agree. I mean, I go back to absolutely agree with everything Ian said, and that's the problem. And I think you can, as an inspector, you're only, and I know we've been saying that we don't have a blank copy of this to send out, but to a company that is still relatively new in it, what they need is a copy of an IMCA, of an MISW before they even think about it. They're not to then come back to you for advice on how they then fulfill that's when you say to them, you're going to need to use an outside party to make sure that you're ready and prepared for this. So I do think that's, in the small craft area, I think that's the biggest potential conflict of interest, is because it's the operator asking for the inspection. So there's automatically almost nobody else even knows about this at this stage, but it makes it an almost worthless document at the end of the day if all that happens is a consultation and inspection process all going on. But don't underestimate how small some of the boats are. I was out in Germany last week and there was a 12.5 metre aluminium boat there that steamed out from the UK. That's working on doing survey work out in the Baltic. So there's a lot of very small, single man operators out there. So.
Oh, I guess, I mean, I'm not saying that at all. I just think that if the industry is going to impose a standard, whether you're 23.99 or 12 metres long, then all those boats who want to trade in that industry need to know what they should have.
Yes, and that's where they should be hiring consultants, not their MISW inspector to do that, to assist with that. Sorry.
Just a comment on this. I think we work together on this one wind farm, where we're going to go, I think in the future, to more and more like this kind of virgin areas where there are no offshore experience, and that there's a wind farm developer who wants to put up his wind farm offshore, but then, secondary contractors, turbine manufacturers, they're putting their standards, but then all of a sudden you're faced with, well, I need a vessel who, according to the wind farm developer, just needs to be, have a flag and have a national standard, and then they've never heard of IMCA, they've never heard of anything, and then all of a sudden everybody then is surprised, what these standards? I don't need these standards, because they're afraid that the prices are going to go up and so on and so on. So it is very workable. You have to be in time. You've got to work on a fine line and have some diplomacy. But I think that with everybody going to the same goal to put up this wind farm and so on, then you get there.
Is this function? I've done a lot of small workboats inspections and also in ISOA, and to be honest, I've never seen one without a class.
Oh, really?
In Germany,
right.
It's classed. Danish boats is classed. Swedish boats is classed. Everyone is classed. So it's probably here in UK that you have this code system, and we all know that the Germans have already been pretty up on that one, because certificates is hardly not STCW, but therefore I think it's not something that is new and working area, I will say,
I
it's
think-
the same more or less in
Well, yeah. Outside of Europe, anything goes.
I think that's
Yeah.
correct, but I want to see here in Europe.
But that's where INCA and the MISW has got its greatest benefit to people, is in areas. I totally agree with you. You could argue, and I've heard people argue this, I've got a class certificate, I've got full ISM, why do I need an MISW? That's one argument.
They need it as well as everyone.
Yes. Right. But then you've also got markets, particularly West Africa. If you're looking at crew transfer vessels in West or East Africa, you could be talking about a wooden skiff with an outboard engine that needs to be, disqualified from the process. And you only have to talk to the likes of Demi and Yandanul to know that that's what they're up against. They are being presented with open boats as crew transfer vessels.
USA.
Yeah. So,
Vessels which are classed by the US Coast Guard.
Yeah.
The standards are not as high as we would require.
so
Sorry.
yes.
This is sort of a conflict of interest, so I just wanted to kind of explore a bit more. Some of us in remoter areas or whatever may be the go-to person for codings, SCV coding, and then there are not that many of us doing the AVIs, and so be the go-to person for the AVI as well. I mean, you're fundamentally doing a different process.
I
If I can just ask a question.
Yeah.
I understand the point you're making about a potential conflict of interest, but I think that needs to be, whose decision is it for this conflict of interest, and there perhaps needs to be some clarification whether you can or you cannot do it, because if one was to go ahead and do that and then be accused later of, it's a grey area that I think needs to be clarified. Either there is a conflict and you cannot do it, or it's recognised as two completely different processes and you can do it.
Absolutely. As I say, my background was in surveying originally. The only person who can make the decision as to whether you've got a conflict of interest is the surveyor or the inspector. You can't expect a vessel operator to do it. You can't expect the end reader.
You can't expect the surveyor to do it.
Well, I think
He's the person with a conflict.
I would say that the surveyor, one of your jobs as a surveyor, first and foremost, is am I being independent and have I got a conflict of interest? That there's only one person who can make that decision, I would say, is the surveyor. Now, whether you legally I'm not suggesting, I take Ian's point on board completely about, in a perfect world, the SCV2, which is, for those of you who don't know, that's our annual survey for UK workboats, an SCV2 and an MISW, then having them done by separate people, yes, I can see the advantage of that, but we're in the same position in our neck of the woods. We would struggle to find somebody who can do both, and we use the same organisation to do both of those. There is a difference. The annual renewal on a workboat is more machinery based, where an MISW should be a safety management review, but of course there's a huge crossover, multiple layers there, but I would still say it's up to the surveyor to make that call. I mean, certainly the IIMS Institute of Marine Surveying, that's always been one of the mantras is, it has to be the surveyor's responsibility to put his hand up and is he fit, is he competent, and is he being independent? And I don't think that should be legislated. I think it should be up to the surveyor.
How the surveyor would ever say it's not being independent.
If I was hired in my previous days, if I was hired as a consultant, I would never then survey the vessel. If somebody came to me and said, I need a repair strategy for putting this keel back on the bottom of this boat, or fixing this, bit that's been a fishing boat that's been, the side's been badly damaged, I wouldn't then go and expect to then be renewing the coding on that vessel if I was involved in the repair strategy for that vessel. Yeah.
But I think that's slightly different. Slightly different from doing the SCV code, and then doing the MISW.
Yes, I'm not disagreeing with you on that, and I'm not here to. I'm only here to give an operator's point of view. It's obviously for the likes of the powers that be at IMCA and the IIMS to decide whether, but I would say that it's your guiding light has got to be you as a surveyor have got to decide where, when you cross that line. I think you're the only person who can, personally.
I think it's worthwhile making the point that the operator wants the boat. The operator wants the boat to be operated and safe. You know, the minute you do a poor CMID or a MSIW on a vessel that's working in our industry, they get stood down and they lose £1,500 a day. You know, so they'll often say, you know, no matter what you find, tell us, because we put it right before it goes on that contract. So, you know, there's the other side of the coin as well. So.
Okay, if I can just, sorry to push on, but I want to just go through a few of these if I could. Again, I'm only highlighting this because these are specific things where we have had problems in the past, not with any particular category of background of surveyor, but I've had a surveyor on board our boat insisting that our boat requires to have a radio logbook, and I can even show them the legislation and they're not having it any other way. They're saying it's got to have a radio logbook. It doesn't have to have a radio logbook. It's over 300 tons. It's not required to have a radio logbook. And as I'll sort of allude to later, how many bits of paper do you want this poor helmsman to actually try and complete simultaneously? He's got his own logbook. He's probably got some daily progress report for the client. He's then being asked to do a radio logbook, enter data on a tablet that the contractor wants him to enter. We've got to be sensible. However, I would also say you might not need a logbook, but you should have, and you should be as a surveyor looking at what are the periodic checks that are being done on the radio equipment, on the emergency equipment. And also legally, if you're not going to have a logbook, you must have some way, a radio logbook, you must have some way of recording distress messages, or particularly what we do is to make sure that all conversations with vessels about entering their 500 metre zone are all written down in the ship's daily deck log. So as that's happening, again, you've got one man here driving the boat, managing the radios, but he's still going to need to make some record of that permission to enter a 500 metre zone. So while you might not have a GMDSS radio logbook, there's a need for some recording. I jumped to section 11 here. I'll come back in sequence in a minute, only because 11 is again the area which covers radio, and again the guidance notes here don't make sense to me. It just used the term regular intervals. Well, even if these boats are not GMDSS or they're voluntary fit, the SOLAS requirements for radio maintenance and safety equipment maintenance they're not exactly onerous. So I would say that the boat should have records showing that there's been daily voice checks, there's been a DSC external check once a week, the batteries have been checked. All that should be recorded on any vessel that's suitable and fit for purpose, as you say, fit for working in this sort of construction or wind farm environment. Equally, going back to that earlier slide about certificates, the lack of a formal class radio annual survey where somebody's actually going to test the equipment, there is a danger here, and this has happened to us, where we have had a boat on site where over the space of a few months, the marine coordinator has said, your radio is getting quieter and quieter. We've got 2 VHFs, but they'll swap from one to the other. And it's invariably, it's water coming down, poor connection on the antenna that's starting to affect. So that sort of thing will not get checked. If you just simply do a voice call while you're doing the annual code inspection, you might not pick up on that at all. The guidance, that is worth reading. I know it's an NCA document, but the OAN 582, which is giving specific guidance to surveyors, NCA surveyors who are inspecting small craft, does go into this. In fact, they highlight that exact problem of water ingress. So I would think the least that you should be doing is following the OAN 582 recommendation, or recommending that they get a class, radio survey done. Because comms is what it's all about on a wind farm, as Ian will tell you. It's company is heavily involved in that side of things. So here we go. This one, had to put it in. It never ceases to amaze me. Our boats are only 18.5 meters long. It doesn't take that long to get in all the compartments. You need to go in all the compartments. There is absolutely no ifs and buts about it. We still see, not MECAL surveyors, but we still have surveyors come on board who perhaps go in 1 or 2 of our voids. It would take you no more than 15 minutes to go around our boats and go in every single compartment. What we do before an inspection, and I would suggest, I'm sure many of you do this, our crew are primed to make sure every hatch on the vessel is undogged. They leave them in place, obviously, for safety's sake. They're all undogged. And once that surveyor starts going off around, there's a crew member assigned to him who just basically opens hatches, turns the light on for him if you can't see where the light is, make sure he's safe in the void. As soon as he comes back out, puts the hatch back on. If you do that, if you're prepared, you can get round, and that there is no excuse for not going in every single space on a boat that's under 24 meters long. Obviously, if it's a multi-cat or some barge or something that you do have obviously environmental issues and enclosed space issues to consider as well, which might slow you down a bit. However, I would say that even then, as we all should be doing, you're analysing your inspection process on a risk base, and you should be focusing on key areas. So yeah, you're not going to go and spend half an hour in a void that is just an empty space. You are going to focus on, particularly in the crew transfer end, it's basically either end of the vessel where you're going to find most of the significant, serious structural issues. Sorry, that's a bit dark, but basically the bow area, we spend most of our time pushing on and off towers. For a boat that's a few years old, it will be thousands of push-ons, many of them done in less than ideal weather conditions. Yes, you've got a big fender there, but the underlying structure of the vessel, whether it's aluminium in that case or GRP, is taking some pretty serious blows. At the other end of the vessel, again, both GRP and aluminium boats, there have been a lot of problems with cracks in the actual plates. Some of it were sort of design issues, stringers and things ending mid-plate or not being tapered out, hard spots, that sort of thing. But even the best built boat, when you're sat on a tower at sort of 3/4 and above RPM, and you've got a boat like this with sort of a couple of thousand horsepower, that's an awful lot of vibration. And they can be pushed onto a tower. If they're doing fuel transfer work, CTV can be pushed onto a tower for over an hour at 80% RPM. So that's a huge amount of vibration that needs, very close inspection of wells, plates. No company's immune. Everyone's been affected by it. And it's an area to focus on. Is basically think of the either end of the boat are the most important things if you're pushing onto towers. If you're a GRP boat, similar problems, although on the whole GRP fares better in compression and those sorts of loads. You don't get the sort of weld failure. That's the bow of one of our boats during the construction phase, I hasten to add, not more recently. We've got inspection hatches on every single one of those, but obviously there's limited access into them. Everything else on the boat, that's the base of a typical knuckle boom crane. You can imagine at 25 knots slamming into a short head sea, the loads involved on that are enormous, far more than it would ever encounter in terms of its working life as a crane. Holding down bolts and obviously to the deck as well, not just the base of the crane. It's areas that you've got to think how fast these boats are operating. Obviously, they're normally being inspected in some nice quiet harbour, but don't forget what they actually do on their daily work. Stability, and I say our skippers are as guilty of this as anybody. There is this huge assumption in the wind farm industry, because so many of the boats are catamarans, there's just this assumption that there are no stability issues because they're a catamaran. Well, clearly there are, particularly when it comes to trim. much more so than than the list that the boat's going to have. So I think as an inspector, you need to be looking at the stability booklet. Stability booklet for a small craft, there is no reason why either the original document or a subsequent document can't be made up. It just gives you a whole bunch of simple load cases with, this is what it looks like with a 2-ton generator sitting in the middle of the foredeck. This is what it looks like with 3 2-ton generators sitting in the middle of the foredeck. And obviously just quizzing people on, are they recording the load line, draft marks, when they're actually carrying cargo. Yes, go on.
Can I just ask a question?
Yeah.
This is particularly with reference to crew transfer vessels which are travelling at high speed.
Yes.
And I've done quite a lot of high speed vessels,
Right.
not
Yes.
just in this country,
Yes.
but overseas.
Yeah.
And there's one or two consistencies coming up now. I mean, I've noticed most of these vessels are not classed as high speed vessels. They're coded as well.
Yes.
In this country.
Yes.
Overseas, it's slightly different. The one increasing number that when I talk to the skippers about the stability of the vessels, there's quite a lot of them where their knowledge of stability is adequate and know more. But when it comes to talking about high speed, the effect of high speed stability, then it's very scanty. A lot of them, even those with STCW certificates.
Yes.
Knowledge of quartering and following seas.
Yeah.
Also the effects of wash as well, which is another thing. Now, how do we report this? Because when we ask the question, does somebody understand the stability or the basic language? Yes, they understand basic stability, but no more. But this also is the operator's instructions, and on some of these ships, the operator's instructions are few and far between.
Yes.
Having said that, lots of the vessels, the stability books are excellent.
Yes.
And they're also high speed. They're also classed as high speed as well. That's mentioned high speed. So you have all the conditions.
Yes.
But the interpretation by the crew is not good.
Yeah.
I mean, this is not a question. This is a comment. So
Yes. No.
Do you have any?
I totally agree. And the problem is, as any of you are aware, I don't know what the knowledge is of the actual COCs involved at this level. We went from the yacht master, which was being used both in the workboat and in the sailing sort of sector. This is for UK workboats, and indeed a lot of Dutch seafarers have chosen to have these qualifications as well, the UK qualifications. Unfortunately, even at the Master 200 level, which is that's a local UK issued 200-ton ticket. It's on paper, it says it's an STCW ticket. It's actually issued by the UK authority and not necessarily recognised outside of the UK. The problem with it is there is still no legal requirement for the stability qualification within that. There is a one-day MTA stability course, which thankfully the likes of Orsted are now insisting upon, as they are also insisting on things like, do you have a procedure in place for following seas? So that we're seeing it being driven by the customer. It shouldn't really need to be driven by the customer. But as far as if you're doing an inspection, the questions that you're going to be asking, just in the same way about radar and electronic chart systems, you can only report on what you find on the day, and that is only going to be one crew member, unfortunately. He might be just about to go off shift, and the next guy doesn't have any stability experience. So I'm afraid we are it's a weak area, I would say, for the work, particularly the UK workboats. And it's really on us as in our safety management system. All of our masters have done at least the one-day MCA stability course, but our stability books do have load cases, conditions in them. I would say the most reasonable question to ask any master on the CTV is just ask him what's his maximum load on the foredeck in sort of a general distribution. You'll probably find half of them couldn't tell you.
It's also about the turning effect as well.
Yes. Absolutely. Yeah.
And also matters related to trim.
Yes, or the following sea issue in these quartering seas in these catamarans is hairy, and I've driven them, and it is hairy to say the least. It's the last, that's when you will be wishing you hadn't put as much cargo as you could have done on the foredeck. So again, we are reviewing here. Remember, we are trying to review the safety management system. So now to flip from that element, the human element, to go back to perhaps a more mechanical element. This question, 10.1 in the MISW, to me is outdated, and we do need to do something about this. Our fire detectors were fitted in working order, and there is no requirement in the MISW. It even asks you a question as to what are the alternatives if there aren't fire detectors present. Well, I would say all vessels should have both smoke and fire detectors in all machinery spaces, but much more importantly than that, because otherwise you'll run into what we'll look at in a minute, the problem that the Topaz had, any space where there's a fire risk. So again, that's got to be obviously risk assessed, but it's not difficult on a small boat to say, well, hang on, you've got a generator, and I've been on class vessels, sub 24 meters, that have generators without any, they might have a smoke detector in the space, but they don't actually have any fire suppression system in that space. And they've got a 100 horsepower generator in a void that's not in the main engine room. So if you're not familiar with this, this occurred off the east coast of England in 2014. Thankfully, nobody was injured. Very quick action by the crew, thankfully. But it was it should never have happened in the first place, both from a build point of view, but actually for us, or you as inspectors, the MAIB took everybody to task over this for the wording, both the MCA and IMCA, of their inspection criteria. So basically the boat, it had, I can't remember how many were on board, but there were technicians on board as well as the crew themselves, I believe. But everyone abandoned to life raft thing, sank, not surprisingly. This was the cause of the problem. You may be, if you've got a small boat background, it's an Eberspacher heater, very common, diesel-powered warm air heater, very common in the sub 24 meter vessels, in a space that was not considered a machinery space. Therefore, there was no requirement to have any form of fire or smoke detection and no form of suppression. Yes, if you read the MAIB report, there were some, there were mistakes made by lots of different parties, including there were some modifications to the heater that hadn't been serviced, etc., etc. But the long and the short of it is if you're going to put a diesel heater with an exhaust that's capable of nearly 400 degrees, basically the exhaust, the inspection, the investigation concluded that the exhaust set fire to the deckhead, basically, and to GRP mode.
Mike, just coming back to the original question about conflict of interest. It's
yes.
quite interesting now, because we as inspectors have actually said not to make recommendations.
Right.
We
yes.
state facts.
State facts.
So, I mean, if I go on the ship and see the vessel and see something, I know exactly what that machine is.
Yes.
My instinct certainly as a seaman was to say, why haven't you got a fire detector?
Yes.
You should have a fire detector. But I can't say that.
No.
All I can say is this space has not got a detector. So
I totally agree. That would have, I think that would have been enough, because hopefully any company.
One hopes then that the only company has actually done. So is that a finding? I suppose that is a finding.
I would say it's a finding without being a recommendation. You're absolutely right. You don't want to fall into that trap of saying, well, you should fit this model or that model or this bigger fire extinguisher. But you can say there's a space with a diesel heater in it that has neither a smoke detector, a fire detector, nor any fire suppression system. I would hope that would set alarm bells off with everybody, including the charterer.
So I assume on that one there was nothing said about it. It was just.
No, that's a good point. I don't know if anyone has. I've not read the individual MISW or CMID that went with that, but that is the finding out the MAIB report. So presumably they have read it. But it went through coding surveys, eCMIDs, internal audits, everything, and it didn't get flagged up. So, but you're absolutely right. It's not our place to make recommendations. It's our place to make observations and findings. Yeah.
Would you say specify thrusters in the same way?
Right. Yeah.
Would you agree with that?
I definitely. Well, I have to say, yeah. Particularly on a sub 24 meter boat where they may be electric, I would say the fire risk if they're hydraulic is not significant. I don't know people's thoughts on that, but I would certainly say if you've got a 3, 4, 5 kilowatt electric motor as a bow thruster, then yes, you do have a fire risk. Whether, again, you know, there are other ways to mitigate that risk, possibly, but no, I would agree any large electrical item poses the same risk if it's a motor. But again, you can only make observations. Likewise, many of you will be familiar with this surface effect vessel, another one, almost, you know, what's very sad about this has happened nearly a year after the Topaz, for basically the whole same set of reasons. The air intake fan system was not considered a machinery space. There was insufficient smoke detection system, but more importantly, there was insufficient suppression systems in that. So even though they at one point were then aware of it on fire, there was nothing they could do about it anyway. So again, you know, that should have been designed out during build or early surveys. Just a quick, sorry, Ian.
It was a very complicated vessel.
Oh, totally agree. I wouldn't like to survey that. Yeah. Yes.
So it didn't matter what it had, it was disconnected because the crew were not competent
Yeah.
to run it. And that came back to crew competency on it. I read the full report.
Yes. I agree completely with that. And as I having worked on some of the larger south boats myself, the alarm system is a big problem on these boats. Again, it goes down to if you've got an engineer, which most of these boats obviously don't have, they're not required to have. If you've got an engineer and alarm's going off, the engineer can go and have a look at what the problem is. If you're driving, you're actually sitting in the helm, your deckhand's down on the foredeck managing the passenger transfers, you haven't got anybody else to go and work out what that alarm is. And there's a myriad of alarms going off, the more complex these vessels get. So yes, the crew competency is an issue, but I would actually say it's almost a vessel management. The manning rules on these boats need to be overhauled. They all need to have 3 as a minimum, even if you don't say that one has to be an engineer. All of these PTVs should be operating with 3 people, in my opinion. So.
You have the similar with the H2C vessel, which caught fire.
You have the similar with the H2C vessel, which caught fire, also a GRP or carbon fiber, but that was also coming back. That could have been stopped, that fire, immediately if you had a competent crew on board.
Yeah.
But they didn't.
Before we beat up on the crew too much, you know, there'll be 2 people. Well, you know, to be fair to some of the operators of it, it has been manned with 3, but most of the time that boat will only be operated with 2 people. You know, well, clearly the helmsman's not in any position to give anybody a hand. He's rather removed from the whole situation.
The operational money comes back to the vessel owner.
Yes, it does. You can. Yeah.
Save money, maybe 15 guys, 10 guys, whatever it is.
The
operational money has to be assessed by the vessel operator.
Yeah.
So that becomes a commercial decision over a safety decision.
Yes, I totally agree with that. And as you can imagine, there would be a very interesting dilemma for us who operate, you know, we operate vessels that could, I would much rather see them with 3 people on board, but if anybody could operate vessels with 2 people, our boats are of the size that we could. You're then going to have the argument between the boats at 24 plus meters overall and the 18 meter boats overall, because that cost of that extra crew is going to be more than your profit margin on that boat per day. So it's I'm afraid, as we all know, it all comes down to money. Just wanted to flag this up. That's a typical FM200. You're going to see basically CO2 on the larger boats. You're going to see StatX systems, and then FM200s are still very popular systems. You know, these things need to be looked at closely. We've had ones where the safety pin, which you can see in the top right, has been left in by an engineer, and then an inspector's gone on board that same day, and he's not spotted that the engineer's forgotten to take the safety pin back out. You know, we've had issues with the pressure gauge being misread. They can read in the red, and they do read in the red on very cold days, for example. Again, we've had issues with inspectors failing fire extinguishers that are actually then passed by the manufacturer saying it's still the same weight. Of course, it was in the red. It was -5 when you surveyed it or inspected it. So just things to be aware of on these sort of smaller craft. Section 15, I could pick loads of different elements out of Section 15 that are very relevant in both the passenger transfer and multi-caps as well. Obviously, all of our business goes on the PTVs, all the business goes on usually at the bow, transferring on and off towers. You've got everything from trip hazards such as those M20 bolts sticking out the deck to your side deck, which you might have thought made a good access point, and then you've got a charterer who's got a boat with a freeboard that's 1 metre higher than yours. Are the crew suitably, sort of skilled to be able to manage that situation? Are there risk assessments on board? When you approached the boat, when you went to survey the boat, did you find it easy to get on and off the boat? That's definitely worth a finding. If you visit the boat, it's on a pontoon, and you've got to climb up a 1 metre, the side of a boat that's got 1 metre above the pontoon, that's definitely worthy of finding, because it'll probably kick the operator into thinking, yeah, I really do need to get a gangway or a set of steps for that boat. Yes, sir.
Roughly, Mike. I've got 2 questions actually, and I do apologise if they might appear a little obscure, but the first one is to do with safe means of access indirectly. Do the CTVs have to do a push-on test before they come to their first TP or DP vessel, where they do?
Yeah. Yes, they do.
I was asked this question when I was trying, and because I'm not particularly experienced on CTVs, I couldn't give them a proper answer. Could you enlighten me as to why that's done? It's something to do with the impact of the cushion, the effect of the...
Yes, so this is on the side of a ship, obviously, but similar sort of lap. So this is what we call the boat landing on the right-hand side there. You've got 2 large steel tubes, generally 1.8 metres apart, although those are narrow on that ship. What they're looking for is what they call the ladder gap distance. And it is simply because once you've pushed on and put somebody onto that ladder, if the boat starts to move on the ladder, is there a safe distance so that you're not actually going to knock the person off, the technician who's now climbing the ladder, you're not going to knock him off. So the common, it was as little as 450, but the industry standard now is between a 500 millimetre gap and a 650 millimetre gap.
So we're responding to an industry standard then?
Yes, we are.
Is this recordable?
Yes, we as daft as the norm is a rep from the client, usually the principal contractor often will actually literally come out with a tape measure, and because of different types of fenders that deform more, they will actually ask you to take it up to either 90% or even 100% RPM, so you're compressing the fenders as much as they can, and then they're looking for a gap between 500 and 650. If you're over 650, it does become too big a step for somebody to make onto the ladder. If you're less than 500, if they're a big person, you're in danger of actually making contact with them on the ladder if the boat moves. So
an observation in that case, that could have quite an effect on the DP model. If it's a small DP vessel, pushing onto a DP vessel.
Yeah, I've pushed on to DP. In fact, that Norman Flower, I'm sure many of you are familiar with, cable laying ship earlier on in the bit. I pushed onto her when we were doing cable laying ops of Helgoland, and that was constantly a problem. In fact, the warranty surveyor eventually just gave up and said, right, you can't push on during the cable laying operations, because we were on fairly large boats with 3,000 horsepower. So if we were overcoming.
Actually, that's to be my last job. I was on a DP2 multi-cap, and the CTV was pushing on and actually drove us off position.
Yeah.
And we were trying to lay a cable
Yeah.
in the corridor.
Yeah.
My second question, and that's the pitch was quite timely. I heard guys refer to that as a surf ladder. Now, I don't know, is surf an acronym for something, or why is it called a surf ladder?
I'm not.
Obscure question.
That was an obscure question. Anybody?
Surf resort from West Africa.
Yeah, the American crew change, fast crew change boats called surf.
There we go. There we go. No, that's a new one to me. So, I know I'm sorry, I'm a bit of time here. So the bow end, just out of some interest, sort of a sideline really here, what's going on. I'm sorry that picture's a little overexposed, but we're moving away. That's an old style bow where we have these defenders. Again, this is really an area which, as an inspector, you need to put your head over the bow and have a look at this, because defenders have in the past been the cause of a lot of problems for wind farm developers. Basically, the way they're attached, they're just standard off-the-shelf defendering, bolted on. If the defender itself splits, you can actually get it compressing through so that you're making steel-to-steel contact with the fastener. If those D cartridges are sort of homemade by the operator, if they've not made sure that the bolts are actually cut off short enough, they're actually right behind the D. So a lot of, for various reasons, but a lot of wind farm developers are now sort of insisting that Ds have to be the sort of on the way out if they haven't already been prohibited on use on site. And what you're seeing now instead are these large, what we call cushion fenders, where there are no fasteners potentially exposed, and you're getting a softer impact as well, which has been a big concern to the industry. With the boats getting larger and larger, the actual impact being made on the towers is actually becoming significant. So mitigating that by some sort of cushion fender. And again, we've got away, this is one of ours, where we've managed to get away. It makes fitting it a lot more difficult, but we've got away from having any bolt heads. So you've got a flush deck fender sort of combination transition, and you've got non-slip on top of the fender. We're not doing anything unique. We're all trying to sort of move towards this approach. We do get these conditions. That's in Helgoland. That's obviously, there's a multi-cat, there's a CTV, 2 boats working in March in Helgoland. It becomes, safe access becomes an absolute nightmare in these sorts of conditions. And we were working in those conditions. They were quite happy. The technicians were, they said once they got inside the tower, they were fine. So they didn't mind being taken out in a blizzard. So, again, heated decks have been trialled by various companies, and it's easier to do on aluminium boats than it is on GRP boats. Heated deck mats have been tried, but basically you just need a solution. And once you get into the Baltic, this becomes a real problem because the freshwater element, obviously, of the top surface water means you end up with a sheet of ice on your foredeck in the wintertime in the Baltic. Yeah, that's a typical day in the Baltic in sort of February, snow everywhere or ice everywhere. We were experimenting with basically not bothering trying to do anything about it on the way out to sea, out to the site because of the spray, freezing on the deck, and then putting rubber grass mats down once we got out there. But I mean, it's just having systems in place to sort of try and counteract some of this. Well, we found this is a very short, sharp, this year was, and last year was as well, a very short, sharp winter. Some of the electric mats that we tried, they're very power intensive, but they are an option. So we did trial that. The most sort of cost effective and simple for what might only be a couple of weeks is to just keep grass mats rolled up that were put aside in a storage bin until you got out there, and then unrolled once you got out there. So applying grit and things has very limited use on a small boat since we've been washed off. Again, easy things to inspect during an MISW. Are there material safety data sheets on board? I would say more importantly than a material safety data sheet, anyone can get that. What you want to be looking for is, has the company risk assessed that product, and is there a cost risk assessment on board? So I would say you need both of those. Our way to try and get around this problem of all these various chemicals and products showing up on boats, we've got centralized purchasing, so we ship everything to the boats from our stores, so that the boats, in theory, should have exactly the same items on board. Therefore, the MSDS and the COSH, they're reviewed annually, and I'll still walk on board the boat and there's a bottle of bleach standing, in the galley. It's human nature. People go off and they go and buy their favorite cleaning product, even though you've told them not to. So I welcome, and I see it frequently with clients doing in-surveys. Open up the locker underneath the galley sink and have a look, and then just randomly say, have you got an MSDS and a cost risk assessment for that item? And it's still a problem area for small boats. Related is going back to what I said earlier about documented compliance with dangerous goods. That's an absolute must nowadays. You know, every wind farm boat is carrying some form of dangerous goods at some point. And this has been a very difficult transition for both the operators and the charterers. And I would say there's an equal amount of blame here. I took that top photo. There wasn't meant to be any dangerous goods on board the boat. I just randomly picked an orange lifting bag, opened it, and you find, you know, half a dozen, 5 jerry cans of petrol sitting on your boat that you didn't know you had because somebody's just brought that on and put it down. The likes of, I would say, Siemens are probably to be congratulated the most on this. Whenever we work with Siemens, we're always getting a manifest the night before, all the MSDS, whether it's blade repair materials, whatever it is, they're certainly, you know, leading the way. But, you know, we are legally obliged to have dangerous goods manifests on board small craft. And in fact, on a small craft, the obligation is those manifests have to go to the office before that vessel sails. And in theory, before you return with goods from the wind farm. So if you're bringing things back from the wind farm that you didn't take out in the morning, you should have a dangerous goods manifest, and it should have been sent to the office by some means before you depart with those goods. Most of the time, it is just the likes of petrol, but we have had some really obscure paint hardeners and various things on board, which, you know, need assessing properly for both medical and fire risk assessment. SAN 75, again, I know it's an MCA, worth reading if you have anything to do with UK workboats. If you're doing an MISW on a UK workboat, you should have both the OAN and that SAN 75. It's basically trying to drag the MGN 280 and the earlier workboat code up to date with the new workboat code, which is not still legal. But the Surveyor's Advice Notice 75, it covers cargo, visibility over cargo, but most importantly, it also, I'll come back to it in a second, it also covers dangerous goods and fuel transfer. So, you know, I would say that's a very handy document. If you're auditing a vessel to its applicable standards, then you need to be, you know, SAN 75 is a very relevant one. This one, in the small boat world, we are still, I'm afraid, a bit behind, obviously, the over 24 metre world. Because our regulations are not standardised, you know, classic one would be you're inspecting the vessel in the UK and it's then going to Germany. Well, you know, the two things, they just don't marry up. Both the vessel needs its own certificate of equivalency, but you also need crew with different qualifications. I'm not going to get into, you know, the argument about the whole crewing issue in Germany. It's a very hot subject at the moment. We operate 5, soon to be 6 boats in German waters. It's a major problem for operators, you know, UK operators trying to operate in Germany. Safe manning document, again, if it's a UK workboat, it can be obtained, although I would say it took us about 3 months to persuade the MCA, this is a few years ago now, to persuade the MCA that they should issue us with the safe manning document. They just kept turning around and saying, well, you're a coded boat, you just follow what the code says. Well, the client, particularly somebody like Ørsted, is going to insist on seeing a safe manning document. Another problem area we've had in the past with, again, discrepancy between the MARPOL vessels and the non-MARPOL vessels. Annex 4 sewage regulations don't apply to vessels that carry 15 passengers. So please just be sensitive to that before you start saying that the boat is deficient in areas of Annex 4, because they don't apply. Yes, I agree, they should apply, certainly in the spirit of it, whether it's holding tanks or placards, you know, talking about disposable waste, but legally, a sub 400 ton 15 passenger vessel or 15 crew vessel doesn't, you know, Annex 4 doesn't apply. Whereas, and this has caught lots of us out in the early days, garbage management plan, subtle difference, it's actually 15 or more persons garbage management plan. A formal garbage management plan is required. Very popular source of income for the German authorities, we found, is turning up without garbage management plan. It's just like fishing in a barrel for them. They get most of the CTVs when they first show up. So yeah.
Just the mark is also international regulation, so just also recommend to check also the national regulations.
Yeah, very good point. Yes, I would say, and that's a very good point. In like, particularly in the Baltic, you are going to face, obviously it's a special area, so you are going to face tighter regulations. So yes, so in fact, it's almost like the same caveat as the manning issue. You know, you might be inspecting the boat in the UK before it mobilises to Germany. They need to make sure they're compliant with the national regulations, or wherever, Finland, Sweden, wherever they're going. This is also covered by SAN 75. This is the deck arrangement on a dry brake coupling for fuel transfer. Say it's probably one of the most, should we say hazardous, but one of the potentially the most hazardous activities that crew transfer vessel does. So you're pumping out of your own tanks because you're not allowed to have tanks on deck. So you've got normally 30 litre limit on the maximum amount of fuel that can be carried in a container on deck. So pumping out your main tanks with a hose, electric or hydraulically driven pump system, and then you need a dry brake coupling so that if the boat was either to suffer an engine failure or a wave was to knock the vessel off the tower, you've got a coupling that can brake and not lose any fuel, in theory, over the side. So you've got strong points, you've got various linkages in the procedure, in the process here that need to be suitable. That's a 500 kilo dry brake coupling. Going with that, obviously, are all the other things you need for dangerous goods as well. The Bravo flag, the all-round red if you're doing fuel transfer at night. A relevant SOPEC, it's another area CTVs are guilty of not updating their SOPEC. They'll have one generic SOPEC instead of all the local contact information because they're moving around all the time. I apologise to the European, non-UK boats, people who are involved in those boats. Obviously, most of what we talked about today is relevant mainly to MCA code, but that is a fairly common standard within our industry if you're not classed. Obviously, we've also got the high-speed offshore service craft code, which is now coming in, this is what's allowing people to carry more than 12 personnel, not passengers. It can carry 12 passengers. It can carry up to 24 technicians or personnel who have got the relevant SDCW qualifications. That's how they've got around it. So we're seeing that both on German boats and on UK boats. Relevant is that you still need a workboat code for relocation because that is on a set route. So the boat would also have if it was a UK boat, it would also have a workboat code, or it would be a class vessel. Just to sort of wrap up now just to give you, that's a typical brig on a simple CTV. That's on the Rampion wind farm at whatever time of the night, 11:30 at night. That boat's just idling. It was on some guard duty. That skipper, who's the helmsman there, he's also being expected to keep regular updates in his logbook. He's being expected to keep regular updates for a daily progress report for the client on a laptop. So you've got probably the crew member now who should be keeping a lookout for the helmsman. He's now busy working at a laptop because the client's going to want the full report soon after midnight. You do need to be somewhat sensitive to what these two crew are actually being asked to do. I'm not saying it's right. I agree with Ian completely. It's our responsibility as operators, to man the boat appropriately for the operations. But that's, that would be 3, possibly 4 persons, certainly. So,
excuse me?
Yes.
What's the man overboard, the procedures on board that's only got 2 crew?
A man overboard, well, the whole system as a requirement for the clients. Yeah, basically you can't, in theory, and some clients do ask us to demonstrate this, is the crew member is meant to be able to pick up the skipper if he falls over the side. So we use the SD sling, which is the sort of, the pole, long extended boat hook, basically, which has got a lifting strop on it, which can drop over the guy's head.
So who's driving when
the helmsman, all of our crew, in fact, it's a general requirement now that the crew has to be able to helm the vessel to undertake a man overboard drill.
Otherwise, you've only got two men, skipper and crew.
Yeah, so with our boats, it's doable, and this is what we practice. So that means one person with the side door open, you will bring the boat alongside, and then pick up the pole, and then pick up the man overboard. And that's what we drill.
So if the guy falls in the water, if the guy was on deck, so the skipper's left driving the boat, and he's got to find this guy that's in the water at night.
Yeah, I agree. Well, we do, I'm not saying it's right, we rely certainly on technology in the sense that all wind farms require a personal locator beacon. It's either a sea marshal or an AIS. We've swapped all ours over to AIS because they're obviously much easier to work with a chart plotter than it is using a sea marshal base station. So all of our crew, and it's a client requirement that all the technicians and all the crew have personal locator beacons. Again, I agree with you, it's not right. I would say, Ian will know the statistics here, I know of one multi-cap that lost somebody overboard. I'm not aware of a CTV losing anybody yet. Ian?
No. I don't know of anybody, but what the gentleman said is right. It's a concern that we've raised for years now.
I agree.
Just to take it stage further, yes.
Just going to say, because we've got...
the bridge should always command, yes, the automatic command.
Yeah.
The next thing is, should the person go overboard at the same time as doing a recovery, then you're completely screwed.
Yeah.
And there's such a reliance on technician usage on a wind farm. And that's also a problem for the developers, for the OEMs, right the way through. And it does come back to commercial. So you can wrap it up on whatever safety
I agree.
Is the commercial consequence of private sale.
I agree.
We've got four tugs with 4 people on and 4 people on them.
Right.
And they raised an issue that if they lose one person on the site, there's only 3 that get that person out. If you want to get 2 people on board the boat to start with, one of them goes over the side.
I agree. There have been a couple of solutions. There's a couple of vessels out there. We have taken this system out. There was a system for actually having a remote station out on deck where you can drive the boat, helm the boat on deck. I've never been a big fan of them because to me, then you're immediately disorientated. One minute you're at the helm, now you're standing looking at beam. That doesn't, and now you've not got any radios either. So that isn't the solution. What I would say is that statistically, again, there has to be a certain element of sort of analysis, risk analysis here. Is all CTVs have very substantial bulwarks, and there should be no reason for somebody to go overboard. Where it would happen, if it was to happen, would probably be over the bow during a transfer, and that is a whole other story, which I would say probably left best alone at this point, because it's what HSE, the Health and Safety Executive, and the MCA are fighting over constantly, which is what is a safe means of transfer onto a ladder off a moving boat. That's another discussion altogether. What I'd like to do, just to wrap up quickly, is I would like to say, the way I see it from an operator's point of view, there's 2 distinct elements here. If we look at the accidents that have happened and are going to happen, there's obviously an enormous human element when you have fast boats with few people on them, working in tight commercial sort of pressure situation. The operator has got to take the entire responsibility for their vetting and selection process. At the moment, that's still far too loose. I'm not going to throw stones because we've certainly made mistakes ourselves, but I can think of at least 3 crew that we have fired because they failed an alcohol test who are still working in the industry. It happens. Even though 2 of those operators, I called them when they got the job and said, I'm just going to tell you that the reason he's no longer with us is, and of course, you get into all sorts of legal situations here. And that's the trouble with our industry at the moment, is everyone is afraid of this litigation thing, and it drives me nuts as an operator. Thankfully, there's enough of us at the operational level where we will try and protect each other. And if somebody, I won't write it, but I will certainly have that conversation over the telephone and tell them why that person's being fired, because the last thing I want to see is a crew who's got a drink problem then showing up on another CTV. It's just an accident waiting to happen. And it leads really heavily, and this year the MCA in the UK are going to be having a real push on this, is this fatigue issue. And fatigue, it's such a complex, as you know, in the large ship world, it's such a complex issue. And the problem for us is we've got generally crew who are working 12 hours on shift and then they're ashore. If they stayed on the boat, we wouldn't have a problem. But they come ashore and then there's all the bright lights and the attractive bars and restaurants of shore life. And that, even if somebody is not drinking to excess or to where there might be where they're exceeding an alcohol, there's even 0 alcohol, you can show up for work at 6 o'clock in the morning and still have a 0 alcohol on your breath. That doesn't mean that you're not fatigued because you had a few pints the night before. So to me, that's, we as operators, the industry has got to get really serious about this. And I'm all for it. I'm all for 0 alcohol on any site we work on. And we warn our crew, we always do our alcohol testing on weather days. There's lots of weather days. They don't know when it's going to happen, but it means that if there's any night when they are thinking of going out and too much beer, it'll be when they think they're going to be weathered off the next day. So what you've got there is this real interesting problem where you could have a perfectly competent person whose performance is impaired by his fatigue. And again, that's a very complex subject which we as operators need to take seriously and goes obviously beyond the realms of a MISW, except you should be looking for evidence of obviously a strong alcohol policy and other ways of assessing crew. How long have the crew been with them? Do they have references? On the machinery side or the mechanical solutions to problems, fire, I would still say, is the most significant hazard. You could argue collision, grounding, fire, all 3 of those are potential hazards. But fire is one that with the right equipment, we should be able to, obviously with the right construction, the right electrical construction initially, but it's tied into exactly what Ian said. You've got far too many alarms going off on these boats, and people haven't got the time to work out whether that alarm is serious. They're deactivating alarms and such like, so you need to continue to almost simplify the boats and make the alarms different. One thing that's really interesting that it's missing in the MISW, I would say probably our single most useful piece of technology on our boats is CCTV. And you will find that virtually every vessel working on a wind farm will have CCTV, but having CCTV that operates that the vessel crew can prove that it's recording, that should, in my opinion, actually end up being a specific line item on an MISW. Some of our boats have got 10, 12 cameras, and they're only under 20 meters in length. So that's a definite. And we've now taken to adding. We've got voice recorders on both our VHF radios. We've also got a basic voyage data recorder where we actually record our chart imagery and our radar images as well to the same unit. Actually, our same CCTV unit records all of that. So that's an area which I would say it's almost more important than, it's not hard to find these wind farms. If you head out of most harbours and just go in the one direction, you're going to bump into the wind farm that you're working on. You can have ECDIS, you can have every toy available for the navigation, but actually a good radar and then good CCTV so that you as a helmsman know exactly what's going on board that boat. I agree it's not a substitute for an extra man, but where we are at the moment, good CCTV coverage of your side decks when you're berthing and all such things, it's a key element of machinery. So, to wrap up, that's what the objective of the ISM code is. However, please don't forget that an awful lot of the sub 24 meter boats that you inspect will not operate to the ISM. So there's the ultimate conundrum. If you're inspecting or auditing to a standard, then you haven't got a standard here to audit to because that boat is not operating to the ISM. We operate our vessels under the ISM, and it's the best way of it. It's a real good, kick up the backside, to be quite honest. But in the meantime, there's an awful lot of operators who don't, and you've just got to be aware of that. So that shows how important the MISW is in this area. If these boats are not operating to ISM, it's the only real true check of their safety management system. And if you do have any further interest, you know, there are probably, Ian will have some, I'm sure will have some examples, but those are probably the four I think of as the most high profile incidents. And you basically got 2 chronic navigational errors, definitely entirely human element of running over a large buoy, running into a into a turbine, and then 2 very sad. One, yes, there's a human element here, but there's also a mechanical element, and certainly the topaz, you know, should never have been allowed to have been inspected and passed as it was. Just to give you some idea of the scale of the industry, this is my second to last slide now. That's where we are at the end of 2017, just in Northern Europe. We obviously were expecting big things in Taiwan and perhaps in the US in time to come as well. We've got 94 offshore wind farms in Northern Europe now. Obviously that covers everything from a couple of turbines right up to London Array. But there's 4,200 turbines out there, and they are being accessed at the moment. There is a shift obviously coming with SOVs and walk-to-work systems, but still at the moment the bulk of those 4,200 turbines are being accessed by small sub-24 metre vessels. And to give you an idea of how much it's going to grow, albeit as I say, a lot of this will be further offshore. We've got 16 gigawatts of capacity now offshore. The UK alone should be at 25 gigawatts by 2030. Germany, 15 gigawatts. So that's just 2 countries out of the 11 that have wind farms. And obviously we're seeing growth in France now. Still a bit political, but Belgium, the Netherlands has got huge growth. So you know, there's a lot of potential to come, plus what's going to happen in Southeast Asia. So there we are. That's it in a nutshell. If you've got any more questions, I'll be happy to. Yeah, sorry.
2 online questions.
Yeah. Okay.
Can we just take those, please? I'm conscious of time. And again, what I might do after when we come to the wrap-up session is ask you guys here to hold your questions for that. So the 2 online questions.
So going back to, so he says, I saw that in the listed certificates, there was no mention of SPS certificate. Is that the case for crew boat less than 500 GRT and transporting more than 12 passengers?
So ISPS, he's asking about, yeah. It's not required. No.
Okay. And the other one? Concerning stability, is compulsory swagger suggested? Okay, so concerning stability, is compulsory suggested to have available on board SWB some manual concerning cargo securing?
I would say if you're doing any cargo operations, you must have a risk assessment that is basically covering that cargo operation. You might have everything from container mounts on deck to just simply some other form of lashing that's a strong point. So the only requirement would be covered by the fact that for any operation you need a risk assessment, whatever it is. So, if anyone like to.
The cargo securing manual is only for 500 GT upwards.
There we go. So
obviously, like you say, if you're transporting goods, making sure that it's faster and have a calculation, the risk-based assessment.
Yeah. On that note, our biggest problem is always, again, we can issue risk assessments as a company to cover all the tasks we know that we do, every day. It's trying to train crew to write risk assessments themselves. So they encounter a new task, it's getting them to stop and think, right, more than a toolbox talk, I actually do need to record something here and write something down. And say something like cargo, we would cover that with our own risk assessment, but risk assessment is a difficult area for the small boats.
So guys, just hold those questions for later. Let's have a very quick coffee break. Can I suggest about 7 minutes for a coffee break? And we'll come back for the last session. Thanks so much. Thanks, Mike.